so many people get into recovery and at like a year or 2 years, they're like, why don't I feel better? I have all this stuff and I have all these friends and I have all these answers and I have all these things and I don't feel better. Going deeper and figuring out what were you trying to solve in the first place? Finding that disconnect, finding tools to show up for that disconnect, to get disengaged from the event. It is just the way that we regulated and the way that we created coping mechanisms to handle our trauma. Trauma is at the heart of so many things that actually showing up and going into what is disconnecting you from this moment, what is disconnecting you from other people, what is disconnecting you from living the fulfilled life that you want. That's where the work starts.
Stories are powerful.
Welcome to the Rise, Recover, Live podcast, brought to you by The Phoenix. This is a space where people impacted by substance use can come to share their story of strength and resilience, get open and honest, and inspire hope and build community through shared experience.
We'll be talking to people in our community on their own recovery journey and shine a light on the topic of recovery in all its forms. Maybe you'll hear some of your story in theirs.
Let's show the world that together we rise, recover, and live.
Welcome to another wonderful, beautiful, absolutely magnificent episode of the Rise, Recover, Live podcast. We are your host, Bryce III, he, him pronouns.
And Liz McKean, she, her pronouns.
And I did not just turn into a dog, I promise you.
Well, we were talking before we hit record about how deeply my love for dogs goes. So it's wonderful. I think we should have more dogs on this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, and then we also talked about like...
She's not done putting her 2 cents in.
We also talked about how, if my relationship with dogs was a water temperature, it'd be lukewarm.
Mine would be the hottest. It would be boiling, beyond boiling. What is Kelvin? Is like Kelvin? Oh, Kelvin was the coldest, right? I don't know. It would be the hottest. The sun.
So you took it back to science school. I don't know what you're doing, Liz.
I don't know, man. These little things that like in my brain, way deep in there, and every once in a while they like open a little door.
Well, how's your energy, aka how's your Kelvin stature?
There's some like physicists listening to this, like I never again. Oh, goodness.
I think it's your high school science teacher that's listening to it being like,
could be. Oh no, just shaking their head.
Just shaking their head.
I have other good qualities, I promise. My energy is magnificent and wonderful, and all the adjectives that you just said. I'm really happy to be here with you and with our guest. And it's a good, albeit rainy day. How's your energy, Bryce?
Nice. The same except for snow. Went to the gym that shall not be named until they pay us, boy, this morning. And in that gym, there is like, you go where the heart monitors and you'll see like it's different colors. There's green and then there's the color that I won't say because it's part of the name. And then there's red, right? And sometimes like the screen, like everybody in a room will hit a color. And to this morning was the first time everybody in the room hit the color red, which is like everybody's heart rate was elevated and everybody was putting in that work and it was just cool. It's like you're in sync. And so I started my day in sync. And I feel like a Backstreet Boy. So with all that being said, Liz, who do we have here today?
Today, we have the kind and patient Tara Mastracchio, who is the founder and CEO of, I'm probably going to say this wrong too, so I'll have her correct me. Samay. Thank you. Samay International, Trauma Recovery and Resiliency. She's bringing exhale to those holding their breath, which is, I think, something dear to both mine and Bryce's heart. So Tara, thank you for being here. How are you today?
I'm excellent. I'm really ecstatic to be here. Anything to connect with, the Phoenix and the Rise Recovery community, I am in. And Kushia, just in case she does have, 2 cents again, that's Kushia is the puppy.
Kushia.
And she was, of course, quiet for the last 2 hours until I came to sit here. And now she has a lot to say.
That is how it always goes. Yeah, no, I hear you. My animals will be sound asleep, and then all of a sudden I'll be on, either a podcast or a meeting, and that's when they decide there's just things to be said, things to do. Well, Tara, I met you at a conference that Bryce and I were at, and I think I came up to the booth that you were sitting at to have just a conversation I brought up the Phoenix as if maybe you had never heard of it, and you were like, girlfriend, I've been part of this from the beginning, like from literally when it started.
OG.
I know. So I would love to hear about that. I mean, we want to hear all about your story, but it's just very cool to have someone here who has been part of the Phoenix since it started. So yeah, tell us all the things.
So much. Oh, God, and we really didn't get into much, so everything's going to be new for you. So,
I know. I can't wait.
My background is actually I'm a retired police sergeant, and I'm all of a sudden I'm like, oh, she's not going to know any of this.
Anyway,
to go back even further, I got sober in 1991. I'm 12-step focused, and so you hear about things in the community that are happening. And so when I retired from law enforcement, I left the country. And I meant to leave for 2 months, and I actually ended up leaving for 8 years. So every once in a while when I came back, I would hear stuff that was going on in the community. And one of the things I heard about was the Phoenix.
Where did you
I'm
go?
always active, and I am always like, all right, sports, workout, fitness, let's do it. And community is huge, and community is such a foundation of fellowship. So I dropped by one random afternoon, not really quite knowing the schedule yet. And I met a gentleman named Rourke at that point in time. And, he started to give me the lowdown on what they were creating. And so since I was still traveling the world, I would kind of do a drop in. And this would have been I'm going to say 12 years ago, but that's a complete guess. That time in my life had no restrictions. So putting it in time is hard. I got to know them. So I would come and I get to be there intensely for a few weeks or a few months and be a huge part of the community. And then I would leave for a year. or a year and a half or 2 years and come back and be huge. And like I would get to back then when we did like ice climbing for New Year's Eve in Ouray, or, oh my God, it was amazing. Or, that was back when Moab was just kind of starting. Like when I would come back, there'd be something new. So I'd be all part of that. And it was amazing. And the volunteer group there that just supported each other and in whatever their form of recovery was and whatever community they came from and whatever community they were creating. So it was enormous. And so many people have come up to me since then and been like, oh, you taught me boxing and I was crying the whole time. Or, oh, you were the yoga instructor. Or I even taught self-defense. I have my own program in self-defense and I taught self-defense there. So I taught boxing. I taught self-defense. I taught yoga. I feel like I taught something else, but like it was soulless. I spent every evening and 8 hours on Sundays.
Wow.
And ever in my life knew you just did not interrupt my Phoenix time. And just what was expected when I was in the country. So amazing to see what's become of it.
So I don't know if it's the ADHD, but there were so many things that you mentioned. I'm like, well, you left the country for 8 years. Where did you go? Did you decide to stay there? Like ice climbing, like police sergeant. Like, so that's what she meant about the being in the room. Like there's so much to dig into. But let's start with, like you left the country. Where did you go and why did you stay there?
Oh my. So this could be so many stories. I will try to pick a track. I will apologize now to your editor. So I planned on leaving to go 1 month to Panama to study Spanish and 1 month to Costa Rica. And then that was going to be my transition time from law enforcement to my next career. And at that time, I just got my second master's when I left law enforcement. So a lot of education in the background. And I was ready to move forward. Well, right before I left, someone came to me and said, I know what you went through because I had quite a tumultuous time when I left law enforcement. There was a lot of other stories behind that. But I do trust the path that I was on. So I just continued on that path. 2 weeks before I left for 2 months, someone came and said, hey, I know the experience you had of people and I want you to have a different experience. Are you willing to go to Africa for 4 months? 2 weeks before I left for 2 months for Central America. And I'm like, and this is what I believe. What I believe is my head is for math and science. My heart is for relationship with people. And my gut or my spirit, whatever you call it, is a relationship with something greater than me. And when I think of making a decision, I run it through all of that. And wherever there's a flag, I should pay attention, but my gut always trumps. So if there's a flag in math and science, do I have the time? Do I have the money? Where's my relationship with people and relationship with myself? And then what is my higher self or my higher power? Whatever you believe in, what's it telling me? And I'm like, yes, of course I'll go to Africa for 4 months. Even though I hadn't even left for Central America yet. He's like, come back, change out your clothes, change out your stuff, and I will have...
Oh, so it wasn't instead. It was like building on that trip.
Oh,
Holy smokes. Okay, keep going.
And that kept going. That was, I'm leaving for 2 months to 8 years. That happened in every step. And it was so divinely inspired and so amazing. And 25 countries, 8 years, 9 languages, 5 continents. I would wake up every morning and I'd be like, okay, A, where am I? B, what language am I speaking? Okay, go. And that was 8 years of my life. I ended up spending 3.5 years in Ecuador. That's where I settled. I needed to stop moving. So I lived in Ecuador for 3.5 years. I had gone there with the intent of starting my business in trauma recovery and resiliency, though it wasn't that yet. It evolved into that. I didn't do it then. I didn't. It just, the doors didn't open, and my entire journey was about, if the door opens, I'll walk through it, and if it doesn't, it means I'm supposed to go somewhere else. So many more questions, so I'll leave that as already a too long answer. So what else you got?
Did you always have that relationship with your intuition where you can follow the signs and be able to identify a door so easily?
I would say that had to be cultivated. I believe this when I teach self-defense, and I believe this in trauma, is we are born with it. And then our life teaches us, in trauma, like I say, that's always going to be a focus of mine. It trains us out of it. All of a sudden we get deregulated. All of a sudden we're taught that it's not okay. All of a sudden our beliefs and the beliefs that are brought to us start to break that down. So we either in a system that nurtures those things or in a system that shuts them down. And mine was shut down. And I find it really interesting that the biggest community that believes in intuition, that hocus pocus, is law enforcement. Who believes in their gut more than a bunch of cops? Isn't that amazing? Because they are obviously the most, like, my first department, which was Providence, Rhode Island, is paramilitary. And, so we talk about kind of hocus pocus and they're like, yeah, whatever. But you talk about your gut and following your instinct, they're like, yeah, absolutely. So really interesting spin on that.
Yeah,
so
all the communities you're part of. That's so interesting. Like yoga, recovery, and then that was the last one that I would have thought that you said. That's incredible.
Isn't it awesome though? Because people are like, oh yeah, that's right, I watched CSI, so I know you're supposed to follow your intuition. Awesome. But yeah, yoga is huge on that. Travel is big on that. Law enforcement, believe it or not, is big on that. And recovery is huge. So it's something that was definitely nurtured in the fact that my life, I started in recovery at 15. And then I have been in sustained recovery since 18. So I've had the ability to nurture that throughout my adult life.
So you found recovery pretty young.
I found recovery extremely young.
I entered into recovery. I was 24, and I felt that was pretty young. I felt like I didn't see a lot of my peers having this experience, and I really had to lean into not what it looked like, but what it felt like. And did you find that having to be your experience at 15? I'm assuming people were going to middle school, early high school, or having babies if you me. But
I was brought in the kind of the back door. Alateen was my first opening to that, and then from Alateen it was substance abuse counselor for myself, and then straight into 12-step programs or other 12-step programs. I was brought in, but I come from a very, very image conscious, nicest way I can put that, place. So what I show to the world, I was taught very young, has to fit in this box. But what happens when the doors are closed, behind closed doors, in the rest of my life was not pretty. So that tears you apart. Then you get really stuck in well, I feel like I should tell somebody, but I told somebody, and this is what happened when I did. So starting to tear apart the fabric of that intuition and that inner knowing. And I was very, very fortunate that people stepped in. So I'm not sure exactly what the question or how to answer it.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, I'm super curious as to what was that like? Did you have to navigate it in solitude? You say some people brought you in their back door, but were there a lot of peers around you? What was that experience like getting sober that young?
My first addiction was I want out. I don't want to feel what I'm feeling. I don't want to be who I am, and I don't want to be where I am. And by the age of 9, I was suicidal, and I was trying to take my own life. Soon after that, there's nothing more lonely than spending my days pretending to be something. I was a scholar athlete, far more of an athlete than a scholar, so I like to explain it. But like that was my thing. So I got my esteem and I got my attention but I knew it was false because I knew in the inside, I had this big, dark, empty abyss. There's this giant emptiness, this black hole that consumed me all day, every day. And then on top of it, I'm pretending to be something else. So I was just torn apart. So I would fill up that dark emptiness with anything, with sports and attention, with people, with acting out in all kinds of ways, with alcohol, with whatever drugs I could get my hands on, with anything, I would fill that hole. Here's a problem with filling that, what we call a God-sized hole, is when I fill it with something that's not meant to be in there, it empties out like a sieve. And for a moment, and this is why I did it, like for a moment when it was full, like for that moment, I was okay. I never tried to be the biggest, the best. Actually, I always tried to be the best, the greatest. But like my goal was to be okay for a moment. That was my entire purpose. So when that emptied back out again, I was completely, utterly alone and miserable and pretending all the time. That was the depth of my loneliness and my darkness. When recovery was brought into me, and it was brought into me because I had the gift of desperation. I got to see in some other groups, like I say, it was all about a front. Everything about my world was a front. So I was in the Just Say No to Drugs and Alcohol groups. I was in the forefront of those groups. And by the way, just in case it does date me, Just Say No was actually the era that was going on at the time. Sorry that anyone who's listening to this right now has no idea what I'm talking about. But yeah, go back another 25 years before you were born and you're on.
We have all ages that listen. And I remember that. It wasn't that long ago. Well, maybe really? It was long ago, but yeah.
So
definitely.
So I was in these groups, and these groups showed me something really beautiful, and they showed a real depth of like, I would go to a conference, and in this room, they're like laughing and like feeling joy. And I'm like, oh, I don't know how to do that. Genuinely, I'm out. And then I'd go down the hall, and in this room, they're crying. And I'm like, oh God, no, like, no way. And that actually inspired the desperation in me to actually turn on the things that I've been turning off since I was a child. I went to one of my counselors, and that counselor brought me to my first legitimate counselor. Not that she was not a legitimate counselor. She was a school counselor, brought me to an outside private counselor. And he actually started sending me to 12-step recovery and to a support program of kids. So like all of a sudden, I was in a room where people actually spoke my language, where people actually spoke of feelings that I was having that I sure as heck wasn't going to speak. So it was actually making connection, because they do say that the opposite of addiction is connection. And so I started to make connection in those rooms because I was never talking about my feelings. But they started to talk about my feelings. And that was amazing to me, because I spent years hiding behind masks my entire life. So to have somebody say something and me be able to identify so deeply, and then finding recovery principles and then using them, and all of a sudden feeling joy and connection and like the things that I'd never felt, family, home, like those concepts were so foreign to me. So that community, which evolved and later evolved into the Phoenix. Oh my God, like I say, that was family to me. And I only say that in past tense because being back, I haven't gotten back into going regularly. I'm very much on the outside, which I will get back into it. I actually literally bought a house this week. So,
nice.
Yes.
Wow. Congratulations.
It's part of the reason my dog's so freaked out.
Where are we? What language do we speak?
Oh my God. And actually she speaks, she understands 3 languages.
Oh my gosh.
We met in Ecuador, and she and 2 siblings were thrown out of a car, and 1 didn't make it and 2 did. And they're not pets necessarily where I lived. So she survived, and she's been with me since. We moved to the United States. So she's traveled the world. Spanish is her first language. Sign language is her second, and English is her third. There's a lot. And then every now and again, she'll hear a little bit of Swahili, a little bit of Hindi, a little Tamil.
That is so cool.
She knows more languages than I do.
She knows more languages than just about any American.
Yeah, by far. Well, and also she's had, I mean, I feel like I'm a person with my dog that, he's my emotional support animal, and I'm definitely his emotional support human, and we've become each other's, and as needy as we are filling, the gaps for each other. But I mean, I think as with many rescue animals, there's trauma there. And I think those of us who have had trauma, like it is so powerful to have an animal that also has had trauma, because you just, you feel less alone. I think anytime you're with another living creature that has had that. And I'm excited to hear about that area of your passion, menu of all the things that you're passionate about, because I know that is such a big part of like what you've built. And it's so interesting too, because when you talk about intuition and these how deeply aligned or just in touch you are with your mind and your heart and your gut, because I think so often when there's trauma and we talk about triggers, you feel very distanced from them, because often the first thing is not the thing that actually is like really you. That for me anyways, the reaction often is a reaction and not like coming from me, but it's so hard to distinguish. So yeah, this is a very non-eloquent way to segue into that, but I'd love to hear about that piece of the work that you've done and what it's looked like and what it is that you do that we can talk about here that I'm sure will apply to so many people listening.
There are so many aspects to this. And it's funny because the first one that mentioned wasn't my work in trauma directly. It was my work in self-defense. Because one of the first things I teach is, and this goes back actually to an earlier question, was I teach people to follow their intuition. No one ever regrets not walking down that alley. So my self-defense isn't about teaching someone to fight. It's about teaching someone to get away.
That's smart.
So, and to teach someone to awareness and confidence are the two things I teach in self-defense. Awareness and confidence, not fighting, awareness and confidence. So if you pause in that moment and have an intuitive thought, then feeding that thought in that moment makes it easier to feed that thought in the next moment. So you start nurturing your own intuition. You start being aware that like, hey, I feel someone walking behind me. Is it a threat? Is it not a threat? And then the skills come in to analyze that. But so what do? Do you just back away and just let them pass? You pay attention, but pay attention first to that feeling, that intuitive thought, and then feed it. So my first thought in intuition is that's what I train in self-defense, is that intuitive thought is your first defense. It is real, it is valid, and no one ever regrets following their intuition.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And well, because like you said before, we're trained not to trust ourselves from an early age. I mean, we're trained not even to ask to go to the bathroom, when we're in school. So like, yeah, talk about like not listening to those inner knowings. Now,
when you get into trauma work in particular, and this is a huge rabbit hole. Again, the intuition, everything about your intuition is so both raw to you and shut down to you. So you have those intuitive thoughts and now you question yourself because you've had a trauma experience. And what are you doing with that intuitive thought now? Are you taking on the trauma? And here's a really important thing. The trauma event, which is often called stress, depending on the situation, and the trauma response. Actually taking those apart. And one of the talks I give is disengaging the trigger, because that's what you're doing. You want to disengage the trauma response from the trauma event. And this is very new because in talk therapy and in EMDR and in those things, you go into the trauma event. In coaching and in progressive things, in neurofeedback, you do not go into the trauma event, at least initially, if at all, because the trauma exists in your body and the trauma exists in your behavior and the trauma exists in your reactions. And like I say, there's going to be so much. And this is my passion. So disengaging the trigger, which is disengaging that response from the event, all of a sudden, that triggering event is no longer has the power. So you start to actually show up for what's happening in your life. You actually start to get skills to be present in the moment. Because trauma, the definition, I wrote this definition, it's not, you won't find it anywhere, but trauma is experiencing anything, mind, body, heart, or spirit, that is not actually happening in the moment. You may not even have a memory of it, but when you smell something, when you go around a corner, when you're driving a car, all of a sudden something flashes into you, mind, body, heart, or spirit, even though it's not actually happening. You're experiencing it, but it's not actually happening at the moment. One of the things that unfortunately Kushia, some of her trauma, is when I came back to Colorado after being gone for, I think it was about 8.5 years at that point, we were hit by a drunk driver and it took 45 minutes to cut us out of the car. And I have no recall of this accident. None. I have no recall of, I know I was driving. I know I was getting off the highway. That's it. That's all I did. I woke up in a CAT scan. My brain shut me off to that memory. However, when I drive down the street, less now than before, if there is anything in my left side view, my body jumps. Oh, wow. I get an instant shock of fear. That's my trauma response from a triggering event. So that's what's happening in my body. Even though it's not happening, there's nothing coming at me to crush me, even though but I'm experiencing that, even though I have no memory of the event. So much. So continue, because if not, I'll just keep rolling.
No, I mean, this is good stuff. I think there is the science, but also like the personal experience aspect of it, because I think we could all have those experiences where, especially when we enter into like living intentionally, or we enter into recovery, or whatever we call it, and there's less of a disengagement with our emotions and our thoughts. Like, it's learning how to show up for those emotions and thoughts that allow for us to show up for life on life's terms. And sometimes there can be these glitches. And I've had a couple of glitches myself where it's like, yo, what is that? Like, what is going on with my body? And it's like, oh no, you don't live like that anymore. So those things that were nothing to you at one point, because that was the life that you lived, like now, if you experience it, like you gotta integrate, and our bodies are so interested in that way. What led you to that work? Like, why the passion? Where did you discover that at?
I started by understanding connection. And Brené Brown talks a lot about, when I study one thing, what I learn is about its opposite. So when I'm trying to learn about connection, I find out about disconnection, or where that disconnection comes from, which is trauma. And like, for me and for so many people in recovery, drugs and alcohol were my solution, not my problem. And there's a guy named Dr. Rafael Cortina, and he says that addiction is a creative adjustment to move one from trauma and to mitigate the pain. And that's just another way of saying that was my solution. It was my solution to my pain. And then all of a sudden, it turned on me, in this case. I won't speak for anyone else. And it became something that started to cause me more pain. But it's a creative adjustment. It's what we do to get by. So what's the point? The point is, so what are we getting away from? What happened? Where are the cracks in our foundation that came long before? Like, what was a pill or a drink or a whatever solving for me? It was solving something for me. And another one of my talks, I'm going to put all my titles out, is cleaning out the closet under the steps. There is something that made us susceptible to a drink or a drug or whatever it might be for someone. It might be sexual acting out. It might be work. It might be whatever it is. But something made us susceptible to that. Because to most people, it's a beverage. To most people, it's a medicine. To most people, it's a social lubricant. It's not a solution. And to me, it was a solution. So I started to look back like, okay, what was I solving? So many people get into recovery, and at like a year or 2 years, they're like, why don't I feel better? I have all this stuff, and I have all these friends, and I have all these answers, and I have all these things, and I don't feel better. So they go looking for something else, when actually, like, my belief is going deeper and figuring out, what were you trying to solve in the first place? What was that trauma that, like, where are the areas where you're holding back? Where you're disconnected from yourself, others, or a higher power? Where's that disconnect? Finding that disconnect, finding tools to show up for that disconnect, to get disengaged from the event. And then when you feel solid, because that's why recovery has to come first. Because if I come to you and if I go into the triggering event, you don't heal a scab by picking at it. So let's step away from that for a minute and say, okay, how about I walk around that thing that cut me? How about I find the way to avoid what harmed me, get some skills in that area? Then maybe I can look back at what is now a memory and not a trigger. Making that trigger into a memory. That's a very different experience when you go to heal it.
I like that. I think one of the things that I've said to people who are not don't identify as being in recovery, or, feel like addiction is something that's very, very separate from them. Often it's someone whose family member is going through it, and they're just like, I don't understand it. Just stop. Like, what the hell? Like, just stop. Like, I don't get it. And I'm like, I first of all, that's a very valid reaction. And I understand you're going through an incredible, like an impossible situation. And the thing that I've said a few times, and I'm like, oh, this is what seems to land with folks, is like, they're trying to feel better. Like, we're all just trying to feel better. And like, we all have different ways of doing that. And yeah, like you said, the thing that we're doing to try to feel better, it does eventually, it becomes its own problem. But also the thing that you're trying to feel better from is still there. And I mean, I love that you said like you would put anything in that hole because your purpose was to feel better, even if it was just for a moment. Like, that moment of feeling better was worth all the other crap, and especially, once your brain is all hijacked and everything, it's like literally nothing else matters than to feel better, even if just for a moment. And I mean, I feel like we've all been in a situation where we just so desperately want to feel better that that's a little bit more maybe accessible for folks and who addiction feels so foreign to. But I love, I just love the way that you're framing it, and that just that reframe, just the reframe of all the things, like kind of like taking a little bit more power back, but also acknowledging where, I don't know, for lack of a better way to say it, it's not your fault. Like crap happened that you just like, that's hurting, you know?
And blame and shame and fault, like those get in your way.
They become
really
new traumas. They become new things that hurt, you know?
And it's not only people in addiction or recovery. Here's the thing, like the National Council of Behavioral Health says that 70% of adult Americans, that's 223 million people, have undergone at least one at least one trauma in their lifetime. Then we talk about big T and little t trauma. Little t trauma is super simple, and I have the most simple explanation for it generally. Is like, if I go around the corner and I stub my toe, here's the difference between stress that we process and stress that becomes trauma. Is when I go around that corner the next time, am I just going to make a wider berth and continue? Or am I going to think about what happened as I walk up to that corner? Did it embed itself, or did I process it through? Was I resilient? Which is why that's actually a big term in Rise, Recover, and in the Phoenix, like resiliency. It's important. So to establish resiliency is, what tools do I have to actually connect to myself? What tools do I have to regulate myself? Dysregulation is what it is. What has set me off? And the nervous system and the vagus nerve and stuff that I will not get into in this conversation, like that's what's set off. Like you are now dysregulated when you go to walk around that corner next time. So that's a little t trauma, but I may not ever walk around a corner again like that. I may think about my stub toe forever. And like I said, that's the smallest example. Maybe it's, and a lot of people, it's really funny thing about this. Like maybe I got really sick. I drank too much, but then I ate strawberries, and I will never do anything that has a smell of strawberries in it again. I hear that story all the time. And I'm like, guess what? It wasn't the strawberries' fault. It has nothing actually to do with strawberries whatsoever. So why don't we disengage so you can eat strawberries again? And then we can start dealing what is about that memory that has embedded itself in you, because it's not about the smell of strawberries. So again, those are little key traumas. What's that?
I said I had a conversation with a guy like that the other day about meatloaf.
The singer or the food?
No, definitely the food.
Could be both.
His mama forced him to eat meatloaf, and he does not eat meatloaf anymore. So, because what I'm hearing too, like at least from that story, there's similarities between a resentment and trauma, and like working through like 12-step program. I'm 12-step as well. And like resentments were those things that I came into the program with. I just had a whole bunch of them. Didn't even know that I have language for them until I got there. And then they gave me the language. I was able to see them and then work through them. So is there any relation to resentment and trauma?
I think that's a fascinating perspective. I want to put a little time onto that thought, but I see it as far as you were angry, the grand you, not you specifically, you had an incident, generally anger, sadness, fear, pain. Did it embed, or did you process through? So it's the exact same process. Were you able to, so I can just be angry and then I may not even think of it ever again. I may never consider it. I process through it, anger, sadness, pain, whatever the feeling is. I'll have a feeling. What am I doing with that feeling? Do I have any skills? Do I have any coping? Do I have any healthy coping mechanisms? A lot of people will have healthy coping mechanisms. Like when we go back to, the people that we've hurt, we'll go back to them. How many actually remember it? Very few. Like, what were you talking about? Like, oh yeah, that's fine, whatever. Because they processed through. We didn't process through. Our coping mechanisms made that stuck. And that's when it becomes resentment. So that feeling becomes resentment when it gets stuck. That stress becomes trauma when it gets stuck. So it's all about I always say the similarity here is in the coping mechanism. Like, did you have the coping to process through, or did you not? And that coping is what takes you from living a healthy, connected life and having all of these anchors holding you back. That's the big difference. So yes, I think they're very related in process and in tools to heal them. But I like the perspective. I'm going to have to put a little thought in. I'll do a little research.
Yeah.
As you may notice, I love to like rely on others. One of my favorite books that is a go-to for me is What Happened to You? And it's by Oprah and Dr. Bruce Perry. And that is like an amazing book to me. And I could quote that to you.
I think I've seen that in our book club. Yeah.
I was going to say, is that a newer one or has that been around for a little while?
It is either her newest or she puts a lot of books out.
Yeah.
I heard she may have put one out since then or very, very recently, as in literally last like 2 months. But if not, then these are most recent. But it is amazing. It is heavy. Like Dr. Bruce Perry, his information and his research and his phenomenal. But he's got a lot. But I rely so much on that. And one of the things it talks about is the fact that like we misdiagnose pretty much everything now. Trauma is at the heart of so many things that we misdiagnose. There's so many things about anxiety and depression and bipolar and conduct disorder that is actually trauma. It is just the way that we regulated and the way that we created coping mechanisms to handle our trauma. So these things are trauma is at the heart of so many things that medication doesn't necessarily need to solve, that actually showing up and going into what is disconnecting you from this moment, what is disconnecting you from other people, what is disconnecting you from living the fulfilled life that you want. That's where the work starts.
I know your organization that you have, I love, I think Bryce and I were both like, oh, when we saw that you helped bring exhale to those holding their breath. So for anyone who's listening, I'm just thinking of me in moments, in very many moments, I hear about like the trauma and the triggers and the listening to your gut and like building those coping skills. And it can feel incredibly overwhelming. Like how, so as far as like how to start, even if you know where to start, like how to start, I feel like is helpful. And I know that, that's where folks like you often come in and have that starting point.
100%. Absolutely overwhelming. Absolutely so much. We don't even necessarily have memories. Never mind being able to address our trauma. We may not even know what that trauma is.
Well, and we're trying to fix it. It's almost like, let me fix my broken arm with my broken arm. I feel like it's so often, let me think my way out of this thing that's in my brain already that's hurting me. So yeah, I feel like you need that outside help.
I'm a big fan of the progressive outside help. I am talk therapy and those therapies have a place. Absolutely. I would never, ever, ever talk down on them. I've used them for years. However, coaching is very, very different. In coaching, what I want to do is I want to identify, adapt, and overcome. That's the direction I go in, just those 3 steps of the trauma. So starting by identifying, starting by finding out, like, where are you holding your breath? Where are you disconnected? Like, I have that image, like I'm from Detroit. I'm going to use the water for you. I'm from Rhode Island. You could probably tell that. I probably should have mentioned, if you don't understand me, put an R or 2 in there. It'll make way more sense. We don't use them where I'm from. Rhode Island is the ocean. Colorado's the mountains. So wherever you're from, when you get to that place, 2 things immediately happen to you. Immediately, your shoulders drop and you exhale.
Mm-hmm.
That is being in the moment. Just at that second, you're allowing yourself to be in the moment. You're allowing yourself to see and smell the ocean. You're allowing yourself to see the mountains and the incredible views. In that moment, you are the most present you could ever be. That's what trauma recovery looks like. You get to be present in this moment. You don't have to live in any other moment. So where does that begin? That begins by finding, like, neurofeedback is outstanding. Neurofeedback is allowing your brain to fix your brain. I don't have to do any conscious thing to do neurofeedback. I literally just sit there and meditate or sleep even for neurofeedback, because the brain is looking for connections that are not effective or efficient. So what is that doing? I mean, it's looking at, was there a sexual assault in my past, or do I drink too much Diet Coke? It doesn't care. It is not discerning one from the other. It is just saying this pathway is ineffective and inefficient, so let me heal it. That's it. Like, and they say, I love this phrase, and I have to find the origin of it, but was it neurons that fire together, wire together?
Wire together.
You see, you know it. I think that's awesome. I was so excited when I first heard that. It's so true. So you're about reestablishing those connections. So how do you do that? You do that by being aware where those misconnections are that you can be aware of. Hey, you know what? I know that when my wife cries, I can't feel that emotion with her. Oh, wow. One way I might know that is she tells me. She might be, I'm pretty sure if that's the situation I'm in, thank God it's not, but that's the situation I'm in, she's going to have mentioned that once or twice. Okay, that's a disconnection. I need to pay attention to that. So I'm going to identify that. I'm going to identify that I know I'm not feeling what they're feeling. Okay. Then we start to adapt. Okay, how can I start to show up in that moment? So literally take the baby steps. Literally go, like with the intuition, when you feel weird about that person, walk away. Literally start flexing the muscle. Start working out that muscle in the smallest possible way. Start paying attention to where you're disconnected and don't do it alone. We didn't create trauma by ourselves. We don't have to heal from it by ourselves. Start bringing people into that cycle because connection heals, and start opening the possibility. We don't have to we don't have to do it alone. There's plenty of people out there. I love coaching. I love working with people. I've gotten to work with combat vets. I've gotten to work when I'm doing neurofeedback. I've gotten to work with, I had somebody in recovery that had struggled a lot with epilepsy, and I got to work with those neuro responses, which was amazing. And kind of coach her through that, which was phenomenal. I've a lot of people in recovery, obviously starting to scale back. Okay, what is it in your life that you want better? That's a great way to start. What in your life do you want different? Okay, start putting some thought into that. Okay, how can we start making those things different? And then when you're there, what got you to the disconnect? What got you to where you're at? And so there's some simple steps. Identify, adapt, overcome.
I feel like just that pause, just giving yourself that pause to honestly, even just picturing like that being at the ocean or being at the mountains and exhaling and letting the shoulders drop. I feel like that was such a visceral description, just what you said, I could feel it. And just even starting by believing that that's possible, because I can feel that just thinking about it is something that I couldn't do before, so just even being able to visualize that is pretty powerful. And yeah, and I think the key is that community is hearing other people talk about it maybe before you're even able to put the words to it yourself.
And verbatim, what you said is what I was thinking about, the fact that people don't know they can have that in their lives, in their relationships, in their time. Like they don't know that peace and that connection to the moment is possible at work, in relationships, at home. Like they don't know. So what is keeping you from that sunlight of the spirit? What is blocking you? What is standing over you? Okay, well, maybe it's this. Okay, let's start there. And then let's see where it came from. And like there is a simple path that you don't have to walk alone. Like having feedback is always helpful. Having another person walk that path with you, extremely helpful. They will see things that you cannot see. So that's why I coach. I also speak. That's kind of a big part of what I'm doing now. I have several jobs, actually. I have just joined the Crisis Assistance and Treatment team, the CAT team in Boulder County. So we are just forming a non-law enforcement crisis response team.
Nice.
Boulder County. It's phenomenal. It's one of those new things that are starting, and I am at absolutely the ground floor to create this for Boulder County, which is phenomenal. I'm really excited for it. So that's the full time. So speaking is something that I do on the side, keeping this business, which I am so passionate about going, kind of getting to see the evolution of mental health, which of course involves addiction.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Nice. And before we get out of here, so nobody speaks as passionately about the things that you speak passionately about without applying them to their own lives.
100%.
That's what I've come to learn is like the people who really are passionate about it are like going, this is 24/7. This is what I think about because this is what I practice. So how do you apply beyond the practice of sharing and developing ways that other people can apply it to their lives? How do you apply it to your life? What does that look like for you now?
I am far from perfect. I am a work in progress always. And I am constantly learning new ways that I have faltered and new ways that I can grow. Being present is what allows me to do that. So I am on a moment basis, on a daily basis, on a constant basis, I am trying to be present. So that presence is what allows me the awareness. So what am I doing? Here's the thing. Back in the day when I was just creating messes all around me, I had that feeling of yuck, but I was so accustomed to it, I was okay with that feeling of yuck. In recovery, I found the feeling of peace. That is the most precious thing in my life, is the feeling of peace. Since I've practiced for so long, I know as soon as I do something, if I feel yuck or if I feel peace, immediately I know. I still choose yuck on occasion. I am still down for the yuck when I'm okay making a little mess that I know I'm going to have to clean up later. But when I exhale and when I breathe and I come back to the moment, I am very aware that what I want is a life of peace. And then I go back to some tools and I go back to some resources and I go back to reading the book and listening to podcasts and like, okay, how can I do this better? And then that is how I learn to do it or offer that to someone else is I'm like, okay, what tool can I bring in? What can I learn? And what amends do I have to go make for the mess? And again, it just grows and grows and grows. And as long as my foundation is solid, as long as I have principles in my daily action that I will fall short on and I show up. So honestly, it's awareness, it's showing up, and it's being willing to honestly move forward with it. And then everything, I wish I had the phrase. I was looking over my notes actually that I keep for speaking. It was something along the lines of like, one of the things I teach, and it's 3 words, like I say, it's not a hard one, but the end of it is learn, like adapt, overcome, and teach. A big part of the process for me is I want everyone to be like, hey, confront your stuff, heal from your stuff, and then go show other people how you did it.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to see more and more of that always. Like take that, because you're going to be better at it. You learn something by teaching it.
Mm-hmm.
I was a better boxer when I was teaching boxing. Absolutely. So pay it forward.
We appreciate you being willing to come and pay it forward on our show today. And I'm going to ask you the question. So if you can go to any version of yourself, it could be a version in the future too, or the past, and tell that version a piece of advice, wisdom, whatever you would tell them, what version of yourself would you choose and what would you tell her?
I'll go for a version of myself that's probably been there throughout my lifetime instead of picking a time in particular. And it's that version of myself that still just sees the dark abyss. Because that still happens. It still happens. I'm not, it's still there. So from that child at the age of 8, and by the way, a child at the age of 8 that is conceiving of taking their lives is inconceivable to me today. To look at an 8-year-old and see that. That feeling of complete misery and lack of hope. So any moment where I don't see hope, if that's tomorrow or if that's 45 years ago, then I want to be able to touch me in that moment. And I want to say, like, the phrase that, believe it or not, touches people is, it's going to be okay. Such a simple phrase. But I want to be able to touch me in that moment of of hopelessness and tell myself, like, it's going to be okay. Like, you're going to walk through this. You're not alone, and you never, ever have to be alone. And you can walk through this. That's probably what I do.
Yeah, somebody need to hear that right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's going to be okay.
Well, we thank you, Tara, for coming through and not only dropping nuggets of wisdom on us and on previous versions of yourself, but also like starting this conversation that maybe somebody hasn't started with themselves, or giving language to people who need the language to be able to move around the pieces in ways that we haven't done previously. And we appreciate the work you do in the community and the work you're doing with the people that you're doing that work with and the work you do on yourself that led you here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. I would love to hear from anybody who was touched by this. Anybody who wants to learn more about this. Anyone, absolutely, 100%.
And how can they do that? How can they do that?
Oh, how can they do that? All right. I can put a lot of things out there. Samay International, SAMAY. It means exhale in Quechua, which is Ecuador's, is where I'm actually building my retreat. So there will be a retreat on trauma recovery and resiliency. So Samay International, because I also work in the US and Ecuador. SamayInternational.com is a great way to contact me either by message or by phone. My phone is absolutely on my website. I am on Facebook and I am on Instagram. Those aren't my favorite mediums yet, but you can contact me through them always. Like I said, my phone number is there and accessible to you. Yeah, I would love to hear from anybody who has even just some feedback or some great ideas or whatever you got. I would love to hear.
We will put all those in the show notes as well. So if you're listening in your car, don't panic. Don't try to write something down while you're driving. We will have those for you and clickable. Just want to echo Bryce and say thank you for being you and for being here. And for everyone who's listening, thank you for being you and for being here. We're so grateful for this whole community. Could not even do this without you. Wouldn't want to. Be sure to hit subscribe and we will see you next time.
So now you're excited. Bryce, Liz, how do I get involved with the Phoenix? Well, my friend, it is super simple. We actually have an app. Head over to the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store, or look in the show notes of this podcast, wherever you're listening to or watching this podcast, and go download the Phoenix app.
The Phoenix app makes it so easy to find classes that are near you or to access our virtual class schedule where you can hop on from the comfort of your home. You can also join our groups and have a conversation with someone from the Phoenix community from anywhere in the world. Please make sure that you join the podcast group where you can connect with Bryce and I and other listeners. Everything that you need is in the show notes. You can also head to our website at www.thephoenix.org. And maybe while you're there, you click the volunteer tab and get even more involved.